Hinesville Chapter 16. The crew took a little time to discuss what their next moves would be. We have a lot of great ideas on how to move forward. Ben looked over the group as they stood in the parking lot. Why don't we start on our way back? But in Sylvania we'll stop. I know a restaurant there where we can get a private area to sit and talk and really make a plan. That sounds better than standing in a parking lot discussing our next step. Nate thinking not only about the plans but the food. Mason turned to Cooper. Do you think you could do the same thing that Vivian just did? Cooper thought about it, wondering if he should or not. I can try, but I probably won't be able to give as much information as Viv did. Why don't we wait until tomorrow to do that? Lane suggested as they all stepped toward their respective cars. They all agreed that would be best and loaded up to head toward Sylvania. Lane hopped in the SUV with Nate, Cooper and Vivian to discuss what they would do the next day, and Mason rode with Ben to talk about what they wanted to tell Dr. Hardy and what to do about Vivian and Cooper. Why don't we start early tomorrow like we did today? Lane looked out at the group and settled his gaze on Cooper. Sure, that sounds good. Cooper turned from the front seat to look at Lane. We don't have to go to the rental place, so what time do you guys want to meet up in Hinesville? How about 7:30? Nate glanced at the two in the back seat in his mirror. We'll be there. Cooper turned back to face the front and rested his gaze on the road, considering what he would have to do in the morning. Lane looked over at Vivian, who seemed quieter than usual, and this concerned him. They made it to Sylvania pretty quickly and Ben got them all to the restaurant. The group headed in, but Lane held Vivian outside for a moment. Wait, Lane stopped Vivian. I want to talk to you. Is everything all right? Vivian turned to Lane, confused as to what could be concerning him. Lane turned to the others. We'll be in a sec. Cooper looked at Vivian, silently questioning her. She nodded and he turned to walk in with the rest of the crew. Vivian looked over at Lane, a little confused. Can you hold that thought for a minute? Lane nodded and waited. Has Cooper been acting a little strange to y'all? In what way do you mean? Lane wanted to see if she noticed something different. He seems to be hovering, and is it me or did what happened this last summer seem to not really affect him that much? Lane nodded. We've noticed the same thing. Okay, so I'm not being paranoid? No, Lane said flatly, and needed to check with Alex on Cooper's background. Between you and me, Vivian looked at Lane and he nodded. In some ways it's creeping me out. Which is stupid. Cooper has been my partner for years, and I've never had a reason to distrust him. You want to reassign partners? Lane questioned her quickly. Maybe so, Vivian shrugged. In fact, that might be a great idea. I can work with any one of you. Lane nodded and knew exactly who to talk to. I'll ask them to make it look like it came from the top. Vivian agreed and thought it would be a great idea. Enough about my paranoia, you needed something? Lane turned back to Vivian. That's some memory you got. I knew it was good, but damn Viv. Vivian sighed and looked over at Lane, feeling she had betrayed him in some way by not telling him. There are some things that just burned into your memory forever. It was a futile attempt to try and turn Lane away from the truth, but she knew Lane better than that. But that's a blessing in this kind of work. Lane watched her as they stood next to the temporary units and she nervously looked around. Is it? Vivian questioned his line of thinking, refocusing her attention back on him. Think about what I went through and then decide if you would want a good memory. But weren't you drugged? The only thing the drugs did to me was distort my concept of time. Vivian glanced around. She looked down and then back up at Lane. Some trauma doesn't ever leave you. Lane raised his eyebrows. Are you going to counseling? Yeah, Vivian nodded but dropped her head as she thought, since I was discharged from the hospital. Have you told your counselor about your memory of that day? Vivian sighed and looked at the ground as she thought quickly. She knew she could trust Lane. He had always looked out for her. No, she stated definitively and looked back up at him. Why not? He was confused as to why she wouldn't mention this very important detail. The group home I grew up in was run by different agencies through the years. Vivian paced nervously next to the SUVs. Everyone they hired would beat the crap out of us. Usually me and this other kid, a little boy, would take the brunt of the shit. Why you and him? Him because he would cry, and me because I wouldn't. Vivian looked over at Lane, making the statement very matter-of-factly. Why wouldn't you cry? Lane knew Vivian analyzed the situation to death. There was a perfectly good rationalization for her. Because, fuck them, Vivian furrowed her brow as she made the statement. Anyway, when the nuns took over, half of the kids would cower waiting to have the living shit knocked out of them when they were told to do something, so the nuns arranged for all of us to go to therapy. No big deal. Lane shrugged and wondered what the complication could be. It was a good idea. Yeah, Vivian nodded, thinking back to those first sessions with her counselors. It was, and it helped a lot. But the therapist would find out how good my memory was, and then bug the nuns to get me to take an IQ test. Well, one of the nuns who knew me well, Senior Patrick, knew what that meant and knew I would understand. She explained to me what it was and the effects it would have on my life, and I said no. You just took her word for it? Lane knew Vivian too, and knew she wouldn't have just relied on the advice of one person. No, Vivian shook her head. I went to the library and looked up everything they had on IQ tests. And then I was absolutely certain that I didn't want to take it. I went home and talked to Senior Patrick, who knew how things really worked in the real world, and we talked about the totality of it all. What do you mean? About not standing out at school? Vivian thought back to middle school and high school. Doing well but not too well. He nodded in understanding, so no one would single you out. I was a ward of the state, Vivian continued to explain her thoughts on all of it. Who would have cared if I disappeared? There were no parents to protest that I wasn't a runaway, no one but the nuns to convince the police I was taken against my will. Vivian sighed as she considered her thoughts. I just wanted a normal life, or as close to normal as I could get. So why reveal it now? We've all been friends for years, and I've known the other guys for almost as long, some longer. I'm sure they put two and two together by now, at least they suspect it. Vivian looked Lane over as he glanced away. There was something about his body language that wasn't right. Even for a senior detective, he seemed more authoritative. And I know I can trust the people who came with me today with anything, including my life. Vivian thought for a moment. Well, part of me wishes I would have left Cooper out of it. You know your secret is safe with us. I wouldn't have included y'all if I didn't think so. Vivian looked over at Lane, part of her wanting to work more closely with him. She missed him as a partner, she felt more at ease with him, even more so than with Cooper. I was on vacation this week, I could have done this on my own. You know, if you ever need anything you can call me. The tone in Lane's voice left no room for doubt in Vivian's mind. I know that, Lane. She looked down at her feet as she kicked some pebbles around. Maybe one day you and me could go get a drink and talk about Iraq. Lane nodded and turned to her. Whenever you want, Viv. Lane looked around, feeling the weight of someone's stare. Come on. Lane stepped toward the building and motioned for her to follow. Let's go in. Lane and Vivian walked into the restaurant discussing what their next move would be, and how to handle the information they received today. The crew made it back to Hinesville about mid-afternoon. Vivian and Cooper went their separate ways, but Mason hit up Vivian for a ride back to Midway so they could talk. You know what's funny? Vivian looked over at Mason. I miss Hinesville already. I like Richmond Hill, but I still miss Hinesville, and it's been less than 24 hours. Mason smiled at her, thinking about her move. Me and Kel are going to miss having you so close. Mason looked at her quizzically. What did Lane want at the restaurant? Vivian sighed and threw her head back. You know, Lane always wanting to make sure I'm okay. She glanced over at Mason. Mason cringed a bit. What did you tell him? The truth. Vivian was very matter-of-fact and shrugged at the statement. I've known Lane for several years, you know that. Are you doing okay? Mason questioned her. I'm doing better. I know I still have a long way to go, but this PTSD is just beyond difficult. It's going to be rough for a while, you know. Mason wished he could help her more. Him and Kelly felt so helpless throughout this whole ordeal. I'm thinking about getting a dog. Vivian tossed around the idea with Mason. Mason chuckled and shook his head. You always wanted one, why not? It's not going to be a therapy dog or anything, but I heard pets help with PTSD, and like you said, I always wanted one. Vivian glanced at Mason and then turned back to the road. What's the worst that could happen? You'd get a dog out of it. Vivian shrugged and continued driving. It's just a thought right now. Cooper climbed into his personal vehicle and drove away. He waited until he was a few blocks away and made the call. What you got? The man questioned as he answered. She took us all the way there. She did it? Cooper reported. I'm going to talk to him about it, but we may shut down operations there quicker than I thought. The man continued, trying to wrap his head around what she had done. She really did it? Yep. One more turn and she would have been there. They cut her off for safety reasons. I think we're going to pick her up sooner than planned.